There's a saying in education that what gets tested gets done. So it's not really a conversation class unless you have a conversation test. In this video, I'll show you how to easily give and grade a conversation test that both measures and improves speaking ability. Let's get started. Now, the first question you've got to be asking yourself is, why even have a conversation test? Isn't that supposed to be the fun part of class? Talking? Well, here's why. In a math class, you have a math test. In a history class, you have a history test. A conversation class must have a conversation test. This is education and human nature. What gets tested gets done. So, if we want to improve speaking ability, we need a test that actually gauges conversational skill. This conversation test is a real-world communication test, directly graded. The grades are objective, accurate, and transparent. This test both measures and improves conversational ability. Okay, now that I've got your attention, here's a quick rundown of how it works. Step 1. 3 students have a 17-minute conversation. Step 2. The conversation is recorded and students transcribe it. Step 3. Voila! Students get extensive personal feedback and teachers get accurate grading data. Now you're definitely thinking to yourself, but my students can't speak that well. They couldn't have a 17-minute conversation. Well, I'm going to tell you, between the midterm and final test, you're going to see an average improvement of about 25%. Because your students are beginning speakers, and beginners in any skill who do a lot of it improve a lot. Alright, now let's break down the what, the why, and most importantly, the how. Before you get started, the very first thing you need to do is get a few items together for your basic setup. These items include a smartphone, an external mic, a battery pack, and a tripod. Once you've gathered these things together, it's time to get started with the conversation. The first thing you need to decide is who tests with whom. For me, 3 partners is perfect. With 2, a non-talkative student adversely affects their partner, and 4 partners is just way too many. Students are put into trios based on their ability. Their first test partners are determined by their score on the first week placement test. If you do not do a placement test, you can just sort them by ability from your own classroom observations. And generally, the better speakers test first. This gives the lesser speakers more time to practice. Now, if you have an even number of students, you might end up with a group who needs a third person. If this happens, I usually get a student of slightly better ability who has already tested and secretly tell them to act as a TV show host. Ask a lot of questions and keep your answers short. And now you might be asking yourself, how do you start the test? Well, I always have 2 groups show up at the same time. That way, if a student is late, I start with the other group. When 3 students have arrived, they come in and sit in a triangle, with 2 facing each other and 1 facing the teacher. When all is ready, I ask a question. And often, trial and error will help me find a good opening question. Now, during the test, you're going to be thinking to yourself, what do I do? Well, basically, the teacher just passively observes. You're going to want to sit and watch like a TV show. And while you're watching, you want to take a few notes to give a basic ability score. For me, I used the GSE, the Global Scale of English, that was produced by the Pearson Company. It helps me to accurately and easily assign a score to my students' ability. We're trying to grade objectively, not subjectively. And as most of the subcomponents of speaking such as grammar, intonation, pronunciation, fluency, accuracy, and comprehension, are indirect subcomponents, they're pretty hard to assess fairly and not really actionable. So don't try to worry about the minutiae or the fine details. Think about the big picture. 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. How long should the test take? Well, that really depends on your student's ability and how much time you have to test them. But I've found that with a 3-person test, 15 to 17 minutes works perfectly because it gives each student an equal opportunity to shine, to speak, and to show their ability. Now, 15 to 17 minutes is a pretty long time to have a conversation for. And from time to time, the conversation will just die. And what do you do if it happens? Well, in my classroom, it just dies. That means they have low ability, and that will be reflected on their low total word count. If students have low ability, I might ask them one question to help them out, but frankly, I let them squirm for a little while. The transcript. Try to think of transcribing your speaking tests as a mirror. For the same reason that every ballet studio and health club has mirrors, every speaking test should be transcribed. Self-monitoring and self-correcting feedback. To a teacher, transcribing might seem like a whole lot of work, and you might ask yourself, who writes the transcripts? Well, the conversation is recorded on teachers' and students' phones. The answer is obvious to me. Students do it. Using a template, students type only what they have said. This transcription uniquely provides improvement after the test because each transcript contains an overabundance of self-correctable errors with no teacher required. In order to figure out the number of times they spoke in the conversation, students will use the numbering function to separate each line of their speech. While they're typing, they'll underline any key vocabulary terms or phrases from our textbook. When they finish typing, they look at the bottom of the document to see how many words they spoke. And now, it's time for some simple math. The students divide how many words they spoke by how many times they spoke, and get the average number of words per utterance. A good rule of thumb is 15 minutes of conversation takes about 60 minutes to transcribe. Now this number will reduce as students get more experienced with transcribing and more familiar with Microsoft Word. Now, if your students are real go-getters or you want to give them a little bit of extra work, you could have them transcribe the whole conversation because it's really a great task. It greatly improves listening ability, and students get the feedback of their partner's mistakes as well. In effect, it triples the amount of feedback each student gets. And it does not take that much longer to transcribe because students are familiar with the transcribing process already. And here's a look into the grading and feedback of the conversation test. Don't forget, this conversation test tries to objectively grade the overall ability, not subjectively grade the subcomponents. We're trying to measure how much students do, not how much they do wrong. Ability is based on students' basic overall holistic speaking score, something that any teacher, native speaker or non-native speaker, could give. In addition, I put a check and give a little extra bonus point if a student is especially well prepared or if they keep the conversation going or even ask a really good question. During the test, I'll jot down any vocabulary that students use and add that to their vocabulary score. The more advanced the vocabulary, the higher their vocabulary score. The next criteria is words, which is basically the total words spoken taken from their transcript. And using this encourages students to speak more and to use better vocabulary. And the final component is the transcript itself. Was it submitted? Was it correct? And was it on time? As you can see, scores are based on what students do, not on what they do wrong. So, these scores encourage students to participate more, to participate fully, and to improve from test to test. Before we finish, here are a few pieces of advice from my experiences using this conversation test in my own classroom. Being that the aim of this test is to improve and increase communications, mistakes mean growth. Mistakes mean that real-world communication is going on. Thus, the more mistakes, the better. Mistakes mean that students went outside their comfort zone to communicate. No mistakes equals no growth. Now you've got to be asking yourself, what about error correction and feedback? That's where the transcripts come in. This conversation test changes everything because anyone can give this test. You don't have to rely on grading matrices made up of grammar, accuracy, fluency, pronunciation, and comprehension scoring. Those are subjective. This test gives you accurate speaking grades, ones that are data-driven and easy to do. In addition, the grading is transparently fair. Students can see their own and everyone else's test performance. And then, students can resolve to speak more and use more vocabulary in future tests. Students know what to expect and what they need to do to get a perfect score. One easy way to boost the score of those low-level beginning speaker classes and boost conversational competency is to have students count their questions and comments and put that in a separate column. And give students bonus points for the more questions and comments they ask. Students will grasp that follow-up questions and comments are an easy way to get points. Once they get the hang of asking follow-up questions, How often should you do these type of tests? Well, I usually give about 3 tests a semester because the more tests they have, the more feedback and mid-course correction they get. And also, the more opportunity they have to show off their stuff, to show the improvements that they have made and the increases in their ability. I think it's important to have your first speaking test as early in the semester as possible, because the first test gets their attention about the true nature of the course and what you want from them. Think of your students as first-time or beginning ice skaters. After 2 hours of skating, they'll be much better. Are they great skaters? No, not really, but they're greatly improved skaters. Now, you let your students speak, and they will. If you use this test, in general, you should see a great deal of improvement. And this is logical. I mean, think about it. The world's best tennis player, swimmer, or figure skater will not improve much with 10 hours of practice in 1 week. On the other hand, a beginning tennis player will show dramatic improvement if they play for 10 hours in a week. In short, beginners who do a lot improve a lot. Okay, I've showed you the what, the why, and most importantly, the how. Now you can directly and objectively measure speaking ability. Measure how much students do, not how much they do wrong. The test is easy to give and grade. It measures ability, improves ability, gives each student extensive personal feedback, and gives teachers accurate grading and improvement data. And most importantly, students do all the work.